So Belgian police arrested 16 people so far in a wave of anti-terror raids, but key Paris attack suspect Salah Abdeslam slipped the net on Monday. Is the Belgian people feeling safer now?
Not really, because nobody knows how many terrorists there are hiding in Brussels. I mean, arresting 21 is a good step, but there may be another 21 or maybe another 121 around. So one doesn't really feel any more confident that the Belgian authorities are getting on top of this. And until they actually get hold of Salah Abdeslam, I think people will still feel rather worried.
Now, many of the suspects have been found to have been born and raised in Belgium. So, Professor Wang Yiwei here in our studio. Some say Belgium is a safe haven for jihadists. Why is that? Why is terrorists drawn to Belgium?
Well, firstly, Belgium is an artificial country. It's very complex of the political system. There are three major languages: Flanders, the Dutch speakers, the French speakers in the Wallon, and also a small part of German speakers. And so many communes, so it's difficult to manage of some kind of countries. And secondly, for the historical linkage, Belgium is the second industrialized country, so they need more labels from Congo, from Algeria or Tunisia. So not many migrants, go to Europe. And then because Brussels is also the headquarters of the European Union and the NATO, so it's a symbol of freedom of mobility. So it's a huge test for Belgium to deal with this migrant crisis.
So, Mr. Godement, your perspective on the reason why Belgium has suddenly become a sort of incubator for these extremists?
Well, because it's a country that is split between various language communities, and because there have been separatist trends within Belgium, the way to counter the separatist trends has been to do a lot of decentralization, including police work, by the way. So it's as if you had 4 or 5 different countries juxtaposed. Furthermore, borders are never very far. You are just 30 minutes at the most from a border. So this is really at the heart of Europe. But I would like to stress that the other dimension that is often talked about, the social issues, doesn't seem very relevant when you look at the profile of the terrorists who have been identified. They came from actually middle class or even rich families in one case, with very good education. So you have to look at ideology, radical Islam, and the Islamic State for a reason.
Mr. Cameron, your response to this?
Well, I think François Godement's right. It's a complex series of factors here. I think the fact that the police forces are very disparate, there's no overall control, there's poor sharing of data. You don't have video cameras in the streets in Brussels like you do in London or Paris. So I think they're very strict security failings to be found in the Belgian system here, and this is now provoking a major debate about how Belgium can actually sort this out, and I think it will have major repercussions not only for Belgium but for Europe as a whole.
So you think the Belgian government should take the blame for the failure of containing its homegrown terrorists?
Well, certainly it bears a large responsibility, but when you have open borders in Europe, these terrorists could live almost anywhere. Then the question is, what do the local security forces do to try and contain them? And it seems clear that in Brussels, certainly, there's less surveillance on these characters than there are in perhaps Paris, London, or Berlin.
Maybe security reasons is another aspect in this. Mr. Godement, so you have mentioned social issue might not be the key factor in this. You have to evaluate from multiple perspectives, for instance, ideology and many others. But if you search the word Molenbeek, a place where a lot of jihadists and extremists have been found, linked to the Paris attacks and many other attacks that happened in Europe, this is a district with nearly half of the population being immigrants, and an unemployment rate in that region is 30%. Don't you think that social issues have some kind of relevance in this?
I think they are in the background, but the people whom you see becoming active and becoming terrorists are not the worst off people. This is important to note. One of them, for example, was a bus driver in the Brussels system. That's somebody with a very steady salary. The same, by the way, for one of the people who blew themselves up in Paris, who had worked for the Paris subway system, which has excellent pay. The Abdeslam brothers, the five brothers, come from a family which was finally denied social welfare when it appeared that its yearly income had passed 100,000 euro. That's 800,000 Renmin. So, of course, alienation is there. But again, let's come back to this family. They spent all their summers in a nice second house in Morocco, quite happy there. So we have to look at the preaching and the hatred coming from some quarters.
Mr. Cameron, if you look at the roots of these extremists, what do you see that's in common in all of them?
Well, they have a very sort of, to them, attractive ideology. Jihadists, it's much more powerful than Al-Qaeda in terms of they want to launch a global jihad campaign against the West, and they use social media, they use the internet to great effect, and this obviously has some impact even in a small minority. And of course, if you now can use the internet for all kinds of recruiting as well as making bombs, you have a very difficult weapon at your disposal, and therefore we must take into account how to deal with this on a very broad front. It's a question of education, countering radicalization, monitoring suspects. This is going to be a long campaign using all the forces we have.
Mr. Wang, a long campaign with multiple means to deal with this threat?
Yes, I think if you just focus on the Islamism, it's not double-sided. We're saying I also focus on the European society. In recent years, many European leaders declared that the multicultural society is failed. They not integrate the migrants that enter the body, but cannot live as be considered as the citizens. They're not learning the language. They not believe the same God. So it's a huge challenge for European integration. Let's remember that the founding fathers of the European Union, Jean Monnet, who said that if he can begin European Union, European integration, I think he can start from the culture, not just from the freedom of the mobility of the goods, of the labor, of the capital and the currency. So the cultural community, I think it's very difficult to build. So I think it's a kind of the identity crisis for the European.
Well, speaking of cultural inclusiveness, how can Belgium unite all these mixed culture groups if it itself cannot integrate the Flemish and the French-speaking people?
But traditionally, they have the kin. There are different linguists communes. They have symbolic. But now the modern migrants. They come from Middle East, from Africa. They don't believe actually the democracies. Don't believe the federalism. So that's the kind of failure of the attraction of the capitalism democracy of the Europeans. That is a huge challenge that people even sometimes say it's a clash of civilization.
Mr. Cameron, your response to this?
Well, it's a bit live and let live. I've lived in Brussels for over 20 years. It's a very pleasant place to live. There's almost no violence until quite recently. The communities respect each other, get along with each other. There's not a great deal of intermingling, but the reality is that until just very recently, this has been a city and this has been a country which has generally been rather calm, where you have a very high standard of living and you have more and more migrants. We have about 30% of the population of Brussels as immigrants, including from every country in the EU, most parts of Africa and the Middle East, and people have lived very happily side by side.
Now, Belgium is on its highest alert. Do you think a terrorist threat is imminent now?
Well, nobody can actually rule out another attack. This is what the Belgian government have been saying over the last 48 hours. They obviously have more access to information and intelligence than we have, so we have to take them at face value. I would just say that it is important to try and keep life going as normal. When Britain was facing similar attacks in the 1970s from the Irish Republican Army, there was no question of shutting down schools or universities or concerts. Everything went on as before, because once you start shutting things down, you're basically giving victory to the terrorists.
Now, after the Paris attacks, French have been increasing its air campaign against ISIL. So, Mr. Godement, how is this going to help the continent of Europe feel safer, especially when the homegrown terrorists are armed locally?
No, the homegrown terrorists are people who have been to Syria, who have been back, who in fact have been moving too easily back and forth. 90% of the propaganda from the so-called Islamic State originates from Iraq or Iraq, from the region held, and it serves as a magnet for thousands of recruits who think of an ideal life under the Islamic State. So it is actually a very important target. Furthermore, of course, however we may deplore the carnage that has just happened in Paris, they have actually done many more victims in their immediate neighborhood in the region.
Well, this Belgium on high alert and the French terrorist attacks have also created a lot of other topics, a sideline topic. For instance, the creation and the doom of the Schengen agreements. So, Mr. Wang in the studio right now, is the open border policy now facing its death?
I don't think so.
No?
I think this is the future of the European integration. Europeans benefit from this is freedom for mobility, and other people, including the Chinese, are easy to visit the European countries. So this challenge, of course, is a border security. Basically, I think it's integration of the migrants with the local people. It's not just about the border security. Of course, European integration will be more focused on anti-terror cohesion, European securities, common securities. That's a huge challenge. Not just rely on the NATO to protect them. The European security integration also should be enhanced in this regard.